College of the City University of New York, where she teaches Dominican history and the history of Latinos in the United States. Acosta Corniel is a 2016 Fulbright alumna who conducted research in the Dominican Republic on gender-based violence since the colonial period and about free and enslaved Black women in Santo Domingo during from the 16th to the 18th centuries. She's presented her research internationally, and she's currently working on a book manuscript about gender-based violence, femicide, and women's autonomy in colonial the Dominican Republic, or colonial Santo Domingo. And she's the only historian I have ever seen dance while making a presentation. And when I said, what should we do this fall? People were like, bring Lisette back. So I just want to make a couple of acknowledgments and offer some thank yous. First of all, without University Assistant Millie Guzman-Young, who's here somewhere, it would be like impossible to run all these things. And welcome to Ana Clara Diaz, who's her first day at the center, yeah? And Jacob Reyes and Colin Fontenelle back there who keep us functioning. Nick Streifel, who, yeah, does magic things with video cameras. Anyway, we want to give a special recognition to the Student Center staff that's been hosting us, and particularly Director Kathy Poirier, Matt Landrigan, and Jamie Larkin of the Central Reservations Office, Nick Streifel, and John Dillon, and everybody from catering, without whom everything we've done all fall would have been impossible. And altogether, we want to thank Connecticut Humanities, without which this event would not have been possible. So, thank you, Dr. Acosta Corniel, and welcome to CCSU again. So.
Thank you, Marianne. Hi, everyone, again. I see some familiar faces. That's a good thing. If you were here last time I was here when you brought me, and you're here again, I appreciate you, and I appreciate you for bringing a friend this time, a new person, to this conversation that we're going to have today. And the last time I was here, I think it was a panel with other great colleagues, and you brought me here for 20, 30 minutes, and now I'm here for a full hour. What are we going to talk about? The weather? We're going to talk about what we're doing, you know, our classes, right? No. And it's a two-day thing also, right? Fantastic. But I'm very happy to be here, and I want to thank you, Marianne, and the center for inviting me back, the students, of course, and also CCSU for their welcome hospitality. And as you mentioned, the Student Center. Thank you, Nick, for the wonders, too. I know for making it happen and having the stuff there. And as you gave your thank yous, Marianne, before, you also thanked Connecticut Humanities for making this happen. And I also want to acknowledge them as well, because they're the ones or key players in making this type of events take place, right? And of course, we want to invite people to always support, visit, inquire about the Latin American, Latino, and Caribbean Center here, okay? Because it's important that we have people, you know, that you can buy, you say hello, and that you get to know. I'm gonna say who we are, because I'm part of the dialogue. And also been here twice, so I guess I can claim something. Right? The last time I was here, when I first came, we talked about Juana Gelofa Pelona, and we talked a little bit about Elena running to dance. And the first slide, I have these pictures because it's a little bit of Santo Domingo, and although to you, it may not mean much, although tomorrow in the workshop, we are going to explore more what these pictures, you know, mean Today we're going to focus the conversation on enslavement, freedom, and gender violence in Colonial Santo Domingo. But I wanted to add these two images because you met Juana last year. And these are two photos, one a side photo and one a front photo of the Colegio Dominican in the Dominican Republic. What today is the Dominican Republic, but before it was Santo Domingo when it was first built in the 1530s. And Juana's residence used to be about, I want to say, 3-4 houses is what the document says, from the side street. The convent is located on Calle Hostos and Padre Villini. I hope some of you know who Eugenio Maria de Hostos was for Puerto Ricans and especially for Dominicans. But it's located on Hostos Street. Now, I also included it because the same residence that Juana lived is also the same residence of another woman that I'm going to talk about today, because she was Juana's enslaver. And you're going to get to meet her today. I found Juana in the judicial case that was related to this woman. And this is why I'm sharing these photos today. About what today is the Dominican Republic, and you're going to see, and you can ask me questions later. I have a little skit that I show my students to discuss all of the names that the Dominican Republic has had historically, and we can do that here together. But about what today is the Dominican Republic, when conquistadors arrived to their first permanent settlement, this island was called Haiti. Columbus named it La Española, in English, Hispaniola. And that is where today we have the Dominican Republic on the east side and the Republic of Haiti on the western side. From 1492 to 1865, the island was completely or part called Haiti, La Española, French Saint-Domingue, Spanish Santo Domingo, and the Dominican Republic in different periods. My research focuses on the people that were in the island under Spanish control. We all know, and I hope, why Christopher Columbus wanted to go to Asia and how he ended up in Hispaniola. The plan to return with spices failed for Columbus, but the intent of building wealth was accomplished. And the latter was possible through the enslavement first of the indigenous population of the Caribbean and also Mesoamerica, and later through the trafficking and enslavement of Black Africans. And the Spaniards were able to do this because in 1494, Spain and Portugal signed a treaty known as the Treaty of Tordesillas, and I'm just giving you a little bit of background, and I'll tell you why it's important. And they agreed to divide the globe. Portugal committed to conquer only territory east of Cape Verde, whereas Spain agreed to explore 370 miles west of the same line. This meant, consequently, that Africa was off limits to Spain. So this is why Portugal was able to first dig into the entrepreneurship of and the enslavement of Black Africans. And as a result of that, they served as the middleman for the crown of Spain so that Spain could then traffic, enslave Blacks first to Santo Domingo, Hispaniola, then Puerto Rico, then Cuba, and then the rest of the islands, as well as Mexico, Peru, and what became the lower southwestern U.S. The first enslaved Blacks to arrive in Hispaniola arrived in 1503, and they arrived as enslaved by the crown. There were already enslaved Blacks in Spain since the Middle Ages. So therefore, Spain was able to ship enslaved blacks at the request of Governor Nicolás de Obando in 1502. So they arrived in 1503, about 100 of them. But immediately when they got there, Governor Nicolás de Obando wrote back to the crowd and said, don't send any more blacks because they're rebelling, they're running away, we can't control them. Okay, like you stop, right? The minute that enslaved blacks set foot in this new territory where they were forced to go, they expressed disagreement. That was not their place where they belong and where they wanted to be. And that has to be made clear. However, a lot of people don't discuss and know that many free black women arrived also in the early ages of the conquest. Many free black women began to request travel licenses from Spain to go to the Indies. And many of these travel licenses were granted. Such is the case of a black woman named Catalina and her son Diego, who are granted a license to travel to the Indies in 1513. After presenting a letter of ahorria or manumission. Similarly, in 1527, Inés, described of black color, the color negro, requested to go to specifically Santo Domingo with her daughter Beatriz. In 1536, Catalina Hernández, again of black color, because description was important, and a resident of Seville, requested permission to go to Santo Domingo with her daughter Francisca de Castilla, both after submitting letters of manumission. Catalina and Francisca enter Hispaniola in 1539. So you can see that there was a process. It's not like, oh, I want to go, and you request it today in 2022, and you go in 2023. Sort of like what happens today when you request a visa, right? There's a process still where you request a visa, and if you get it, and then you want to reunite with your family, you bring your family, and then you have to wait, at least for the Dominican Republic, if you want to bring in a brother or sister, it's 10 years, okay? But you get the idea that that was the similar process. What compelled these black women to migrate, apparently voluntarily, to Santo Domingo, we do not know. Because unfortunately, the details in the archival documents are lacking. You simply get the description of the license request, of the visa request, who they travel with, maybe when they enter. In this case, we get the entrance date for 4 of them, and we are lucky. So you have to begin to put together these minor, micro details to build their stories. Therefore, we don't know why they wanted to go there. Maybe they thought they would be better than they were in Seville. There are many reasons why people migrate. Perhaps they were different before than they are today. Perhaps they're similar. But the truth is that, and as Ida Altman points out, a transatlantic and intracolonial migration study is pending about the free and enslaved, the free black women, and also the free black men who went from one colony to the other exploring, and also those who requested licenses to travel directly from Spain to the new conquered colonies. This is definitely a subject that remains to be explored. And I add that not only do we need to look at that intracolonial migration, but again, as I just said, include the requests coming from Spain, also coming from Portugal, because there are many Portuguese last names found in the archives for free blacks in Santo Domingo. And many of them moved from one colony to the other, as is a woman that I'll mention later in the conversation, who went from Santo Domingo to Cuba to Cartagena de Indias, what today is Colombia, right? And this is why this is important. Why then do we find later enslaved blacks in Santo Domingo if, as I just said, when Obando requested them, he wrote back right away and said, don't send any more of them? Well, because the sugar industry sparked. And by 1533, only in Santo Domingo, in Hispaniola, there were 13 sugar mills. That was then the most important product. That important product was replaced in value by humans, specifically black humans. The 13 sugar mills in Hispaniola in 1533 had approximately 2,510 blacks. We do not know the exact amount of the women working in the mills, but historian Jose Luis Saez explains that the number is available with no specific gender, except the mentions of, quote, 100 blacks reside in this mill, end quote. However, he did another study of the mills in 1547, and he explains that there were 32 enslaved black females of 6 different ages at the Ingenio Santiago de la Paz in the city of Asua, owned by Hernando Gorjon. One of the women is registered as deceased, having perished while giving birth at the plantation. 6 women were ages 3 to 15. 4 women were 17 to 25. 6 women were 30 to 40. 8 women were 50. 6 women were 70, and 2 more were 80 and 90 years old, respectively. And I share the ages, and obviously we know that enslaved blacks were brought in different ages, including children. But I share the ages because varying questions come to mind. Were they siblings? Did they know each other? Were they born in the island, meaning were they Creoles? Or were they Bozales, brought directly from Africa? Did any of the young women obtain their freedom, or did they die old enslaved, possibly like the 2 80 and 90-year-old women? So when we look at these numbers and we listen and read about these nameless women, there are lots of questions that filled the spaces. We might not get the answer, but it gets the conversation going. The importance of black women as part of the foundation of American society began to be noticed by local authorities immediately during the first decades. And it is important to highlight that the transatlantic slave trade as an institution in the Americas was first approved in Santo Domingo in 1518 through the issuing of asientos, meaning contract license. So the licenses that the free black women were requesting before, those were personal licenses to travel, to explore, to go to new places. In fact, other people, other colonizers who went from Seville to Santo Domingo requested licenses to be allowed to take enslaved people with them for personal use. 1, 2, 3, 4, 8, but not to traffic. That began in 1518. But it was also in 1518 that the authorities began to understand the value and importance of black women for what they were planning. And therefore, Governor Alonso Suazo wrote to the Spanish crown asking that they send young black bozales enslaved, brought directly from Africa, and also to send black women so that black men and women could marry and be part specifically of the foundation of cities, or more generally, the expansion of the colonized population. This is a clear example of how black women were used as bait to preserve enslaved communities. In the same document, Governor Suazo insists, with more detail, and he goes on to talk about on the importance of sending enslaved black women to La Española. The document mentions the significance of marriage as an axis of settlement and suggests that blacks should be married. Ojo, pay attention, that didn't mean that if they got married, they were free. That was also stipulated in the letter, okay? And he says, quote, "This land is the best in the world for blacks, for women, for old men, and for the wonders that you are allowed to see when in this land you died. The groups of blacks do not have to be permanent, but temporary, chosen every year that the selected one be married so that he may have love for the land." And then 9 years later, in 1527, and with different objectives than those of populating the island, the Spanish crown now orders that blacks be encouraged to marry. And he specifically details the reason. Don Carlos, etc., "For we are informed that as a result of too many blacks having gone to the island of La Española, and there being a few Spanish Christians, it could be the reason of possible unrest or rebellion by the said blacks. It seems that it would be a great remedy to marry the blacks who are taken to the island from this point forward, and the ones living there now, and that they each may have a wife, because that and the love they may have for their wives and children and the institution of marriage would be cause of much pacification for them." The intention of marrying blacks was a strategy to control enslaved men who escaped. With what is proposed, the Spanish crown executed two objectives. First, control blacks, and second, to institute the law of Catholic marriage among the enslaved. The reason for utilizing marriage as a means of control for blacks must have developed to try to prevent another slave revolt, like the rebellion of 1521, generally known until now as the first big slave revolt by enslaved blacks in the Americas, which is actually celebrating its 500-year anniversary recently since it took place. After the revolt happened on the Christmas Eve in 1521, the crown developed a series of laws. Many of those laws not only applied to the enslaved blacks, but it also applied to the free population, including whites. Why? Because it included stipulations that explained that if you, as a free black, housed or helped another enslaved person, you would also suffer consequences, and so would any other Spaniard who also helped. The value of the enslaved cannot be easily estimated. A report by President Alonso Suazo in 1538 requests 200 blacks so that those 200 blacks can help build a wall to protect Hispaniola from future French corsairs. After the French had killed some of the Spaniards and successfully stolen 75 pounds of sugar and 15 enslaved blacks. Apparently, in this case, the life of white men was worth less than that of an enslaved black man or woman. However, nothing became more valuable than the enslaved woman as a slave and as a producer of slave. And of course, we know that the life of the white man was worth more. But in this case, it is important to see and highlight that the pirates, the corsairs, they killed the white man so that they can steal the valuable property. And that valuable property was the 15 enslaved blacks that they were able to take with them. This allows me to move to a document that I want to share. And the next slide, it's in Spanish, but I'm going to give the summary of the English translation. This information is actually from one of the documents in the First Blacks in the Americas database that we are going to be exploring tomorrow. It is document number 44. And the reason why I say that, speaking about value and, you know, and the meaning and the importance of Black women allows me to share this document from 1555 is because of what happened in that year in Colonial Santo Domingo. So a Portuguese ship arrives in Santo Domingo, and they said that they arrived there because turbulence, the water, the wind, and somehow they ended up in Santo Domingo. I am not too geographically inclined, but if they were going to Portugal, I mean, that's a really long vuelta to get to Santo Domingo. That's a big mistake. You know, it must have been some really strong winds that, you know, but even if they're going to Brazil, that's a little far. I mean, that's a really big, that's a lot of wind. But you never know, because the current goes, what is it, east to west? East to west. So, I mean, yes, but that means that it's still wrong, because then they ended up in Santo Domingo. In Santo Domingo, you either go around this way, you go around this way, or you go over the island. I mean, anyhow, it's 1555, and they arrive. They arrive with 169 enslaved blacks, claiming that they got there by accident and that they need provisions, that they need to fix their boat, they need to fix their ship so that they can then move on their trip. But what happens is the Spanish crown says, Yeah, that's a really nice story, but that's really not gonna fly. And they confiscate the cargo. I'm only going to describe a few. I'm gonna share a few of the description, and then we'll move to the document that we're talking about here. They begin describing the cargo, and they say, also, 11 pieces belonging to the pilot, males and females, big and small. Also, Pedro Gonzalez, notary of the said vessel, has 2 pieces of blacks. They were counted as his. Also, 24 pieces of blacks, males and females, big and small, were counted, of Juan Esteves, sailor from the said vessel. So that was just a description of 3 enslavers who purchased. As you can see, one person purchased 24 pieces. But the piece, right, that called my attention is this piece here that we're going to talk about today. It was an enslaved woman who was first bought and then returned. Her description reads as follows. Here is a summary. Honorable Mr. John Junco says that about 3 days ago, he purchased an enslaved black woman at the auction of the blacks brought from Africa for 150 gold pesos. And that after he took her home, he sold her for the same price to Diego Lopez, who paid cash through a servant and a series of intermediaries on behalf of Hernandez Melgarejo. And yesterday, the said enslaved woman appeared to be sick of the wound because her insides were visible, according to the midwives who checked her, and this could be dangerous. We plead to your majesty that we are allowed to return to the auction the black female slave, because it is not fair that the poor man, Diego Lopez, pays for something that is sick and has no value. And we also plead that he gets reimbursed. Let her be inspected by a doctor and by midwives in front of Lope Amado, parentheses, probably a notary, on this day, December 7th, 1555. December 7th, 1555. Midwife Isabel Ramirez was sworn in oath on the date above, declaring that she had indeed seen a black woman who had a falling wound, what is considered a serious illness, and that it would be impossible for the enslaved woman to work in any assigned task without her organs falling out. This may lead to a dangerous situation or her death. The midwife added that the woman cannot be sold as a healthy person or as a healthy piece, given the seriousness of the case. On December 9th, 1555, Dr. Gaspar Cabrera sworn an oath and explained that the enslaved woman had an illness in her lower parts that could not be cured, and as such, she could not be sold as a healthy slave, and that given her illness, much of her value was lost. In today's modern terms, to suffer from a falling wound means to suffer from uterine prolapse. So that now you know a little bit what I'm talking about. Okay. This is the reason why I said that the value of the enslaved black woman cannot easily be, you cannot even begin to figure out how much it was worth, how much it cost, how much, because it was wealth, and it was reproductive wealth, to the point that I'm going to skip to, I think the year is 1706. This is a bonus. This is a document I'm using for something else, but I figure I plug it in, so. This is 1706, and you probably won't be able to read much of the writing. It's in Spanish, but this is about Manuela, a 16-year-old enslaved woman described as being from Congo, and she's inherited among 4 siblings, each to own 1/4 of Manuela. And in the document, they're trying to figure out, disputing the 4 siblings, who's going to sell their part. Sort of like what goes on today, unfortunately, in family members when everyone is trying to sell their parents' house, or car or any other property so that everyone can get their share, right? Well, this was the case of the enslaved, but not just the enslaved black woman. And the title of the talk for today, we have gender violence. Can you think of any other such serious gender violence other than making sure that you inherit a womb so that you can continue to reproduce and reproduce? And interesting how they describe Diego Lopez. They want to make sure el pobre Diego Lopez, pobre del diablo, like poor Diego Lopez, to get reimbursed, right? The choice of words to describe the owners, the enslavers, the oppressors, the colonizers, And then we're going to see the choice of words to describe the Black women in general when we go back to talk about Juana and Elena. But I wanted to share this with you because I think even though it's 1706, it adds to the conversation that there was still slavery going on in Spanish Santo Domingo, because now it's no longer Hispaniola. It was only Hispaniola until 1697, okay? And this is going on in Spanish Santo Domingo. And one of the siblings is saying, well, I'll sell my 1/4, I'll sell my fourth for 50 pesos. What are you going to do? And then they're having this conversation. So this is one document I'm looking at to add to my study. I now want to talk a little bit about 1575 because, again, and I'm going to bring it back to the auctions and slaving. And the reason why I am insistent in this is because you hear about slavery in Saint-Domingue, which was already by 1697. And you hear about Cuba, and you hear about slavery in Brazil and slavery in the US. Mexico has produced a lot of scholarship, and also now Puerto Rico, but still Puerto Rico is a little bit like Santo Domingo. There is scholarship being produced in Puerto Rico by Puerto Ricans in Spanish, and there is scholarship produced about slavery in Santo Domingo in Spanish, but it's not available to multilingual scholars. And I think it's important that we begin to understand the beginning and probably the reason why we have so many issues going on today in the country and also in the island per se. But the woman that we talked about before, the enslaved Black woman with the uterine prolapse, was in 1555. There was another auction in 1575. And people don't talk a lot about, oh, there weren't that many slaves in Santo Domingo. That many? I mean, like, that's not the correct way to phrase it. It doesn't matter. It was an ongoing thing. You have 1575, and despite the lack of interest paid to slavery in Santo Domingo, you had enslaved people still being brought to Santo Domingo. And this cargo arrived on December 16, 1575. And in that cargo, there were 212 Black people that were forcibly brought and sold, one of which is registered as being from Mongolia and 211 from Angola. There were 125 men, 59%, and 87 women, 41%. There were 4 children belonging to 3 of the women and who were sold to the same owner as their mothers. So this family stayed together. Anthony Stevens Acevedo, Tom Wetterings, and Leonor Alvarez Francis offer a compilation of estimated population in 16th century Santo Domingo, with the enslaved population represented by 4,000 enslaved Africans in 1518. And the reason why the amount is 4,000 is because that was the first asiento sign in 1518 Santo Domingo. That was the first contract. So they're documenting that as the first mass enslaved population that was trafficked. But clearly we already know that many were already there with separate licenses. There were 30,000 in 1542, 20,000 in 1568, and 10,000 in 1586, and 9,648 in 1606. So you can see that this is something that ought to be talked about, because what were they doing? What was their experience like? And this is why I shared with you the story of Juana and Elena when I was here last year, because we don't have those stories, and we are slowly building those stories. And actually, that's what you're going to do tomorrow in the workshop. Anyway, so when I first came last year, I shared those 2 pieces, Juana Gelofa Pelona and Elena Running to Dance. They were in development. They were not published yet. They are out now. And if you remember, Juana was from 1549 Santo Domingo. She was the snitch who they kept telling her, don't say what you know or we're gonna whip you, and don't say what you know, we're gonna whip you, don't say what you know, we're gonna burn you with hot wax, and Juana was not paying attention. She went through all of that, and she spoke, right? She continued to talk. The second story was Elena running to dance, 1771 Santo Domingo, the enslaved woman who would run away to dance, and that if there were 3 parties in one night, then she would go to all 3 parties. Elena didn't care. That's why we danced last year when we were here. They were both victims of gender violence. Not only were they treated the way they were treated because of being enslaved, but because they were women. And the primary sources disparage them and validate their descriptions of Juana and Elena based on the rules imposed on them and which excluded whites. 2 days ago, Jessica Marie Johnson wrote on her Twitter, and I quote, "I do so love to see enslaved Black women described by enslaved owners as wicked. It always means that they are up to something world revising," close quote. And I loved it. Not only that, but wicked is also part of her book title, Wicked Flesh, Black Women Intimacy in the Atlantic World. Today, scholars are describing these women as brave, what colonizers ascribed as morally prohibited and evil. Juana and Elena were 2 courageous enslaved Black women who disobey in their own right to access limited freedom through dancing, running away, speaking when told not to, and by being sold. It is important to remember that violence is diverse. This language is violence, not just what the other enslaved women were going through, but the way that they were described and what they were subjected to in a society that forced them and denigrated them. And I described them differently in the 2 articles. If you can remember when I described Elena in the bill of sale, she's described, the witnesses are asked, and is it true that Elena was a maroon? And most of the witnesses say, a maroon? She was no maroon. She was a guinea fowl. In other words, no, she didn't run. She flew. It is very hard to catch a guinea fowl. If you want to punish someone, send them, go catch me, go get me, go fetch me that guinea fowl, okay? They're going to be running for a while because they're very hard to catch. And that was Elena. So I don't describe her as a maroon. She was agile. She ran every other day, 28 miles to get to the destination where she wanted to be. And they also disparaged her for dancing. Okay, she was a performer, skilled, artful. And today, unfortunately, many women who dance are also not described in a positive way. But the image of the enslaved woman suffering from a falling wound returned as damaged merchandise and probably left to die for having no value. That's important to keep in mind, because enslaved people who were sick were not cared for. They were not important because they were not going to produce, right? So that is a violent scenario that most likely too many Black women experience. But today I also want to share another part of my research. And that is the gendered violence also suffered by the Spanish women in the island. And it's very important to me because in that case, where I found Catalina is where I found Juana. Catalina Tinoco was Juana's enslaver, and Juana was one of the witnesses that said, I know that she did this and that, okay. So this is how this research connects. But Free and enslaved black women suffered the gender violence of silence, of not being named, of not being listed. Spanish women also underwent something similar. In the list here, this is a study made from 1492 to 1530 by Vilma Benzo Ferrer, a historian in the Dominican Republic. She gathered the names through the licenses request of people. This book, it's about 500 pages, and it has so many post-its that you will not believe your eyes. You could barely tell one thing from the other because I was trying to count all the women. My research assistant and I were trying to count all the women. But the majority of the percentage, which I think is 54%, if I'm correct, is a list of women without name who accompany their husbands. So the entry says Juan Ramirez and his wife, Jose Esteban and his wife, and so forth. The second list, which is the largest percent, is Spanish women nameless that went with their brothers, and then followed by Spanish women who went with their bosses, so they went as the help. Spanish women who went with their father, Spanish women who went with their son, so the son would be listed, so it would be Juan Ramirez and his mother, without listing the mother's name, okay? And then we have your in-law, so the woman would be listed under the in-law, and the rest are listed simply as daughter, help, or mother. I did this, and this is a work in progress, because I was interested in the story about Catalina Tinoco. Catalina Tinoco was a middle-class Spanish woman in 1549 Santo Domingo. She was allegedly killed by her husband under the accusation of adultery. The laws of las siete partidas allowed the husband to kill the wife and the lover if they were caught, but the husband could not kill one or the other, because if you killed them both, that was the proof that you caught them together. So for them, it made sense. A father was also allowed to kill his daughter for the same reason. A husband could also give a suspected lover 3 warnings, and if he continued to court his wife, the husband could take action. A man could have a servant as a lover, but if a wife was caught with a servant, the servant would be burned and the woman sent away to a convent. However, when the husband killed his wife, he could request a forgiven, a letter of a pardon by the Spanish crown, and he could do this in 3 ways. 1, he could write to the Spanish monarchs and commit to serve their army. 2, write to the Spanish monarchs and claim nobility. 3rd, write to the family and say that he killed her to defend their honor. Most of the times, one of these was granted. Now, let me tell you a little bit about Catalina, and then we wrap up and we chat, right? Catalina was allegedly having an affair with a man known as Lopez de Salazar. Allegedly, she used to sneak him in the house when her husband, Francisco Bravo, was not in the house. She would use some of her enslaved women, such as Juana Gelofa Pelona and Luisica, as lookouts. Witnesses testified that Catalina and Lopez would exchange gifts through a hole that they met in the wall, through the connecting homes. And that Catalina would ask her husband, Francisco, to give her money so that she could buy things from her neighbor, because it would be cheaper to buy things from her neighbor than to go and buy them at the market. She, in turn, would show up at the house with the gifts given by Lopez de Salazar and say that those were the things that she bought from the neighbor. In this order, she would keep both the gift and the money that she asked her husband to give to her. Smart. According to witnesses, Catalina would lock the entrance to the living room, forcing her husband to pass out in the muddy room while Lopez came in through the front window. Witnesses added that they insisted that Catalina quit her affair, but that Catalina would fuss, saying that Lopez de Salazar was better conditioned than Francisco. There's no footnote in the document explaining what better condition meant, but the possibilities may include more handsome, okay, maybe wealthy, stronger, and or better condition in bed. Another witness declared that she warned Catalina to stop her affair, otherwise her husband would cut off her head if he found out. Catalina's alleged response left the witness speechless when Catalina said, open quote, "If my husband was to find out and kill me, I already owe one life to God. It is worth for a woman to love and to have two men who can give her what she needs and not one bad one like mine," close quote. 1549. Catalina was found dead on June 24, 1549. Her husband Francisco disappeared for a couple days, and the alleged lover was nowhere to be found. Her family put out a notice and accused Francisco of the murder. He returned to town and turned himself in, claiming that he was innocent, that who had killed Catalina perhaps had been the lover, Lopez Salazar, that she was already dead when he arrived. The trial lasted 5 years, and despite Catalina's family many appeals, Francisco was released after being able to prove that he was the son of a noble man who was known in Spain and proxy to the crown. The document here shows, and I'm going to move over. I have the arrows pointing. It's in Spanish, but the witness is describing how they found Catalina. And it says that she has slain throat, degollada la garganta, and that there was a lot of blood, that he cut her gaznates, that he cut this part here, and that there were several stab wounds on her left breast. You can see that on the second arrow in the bottom. That's what it says in Spanish. Now, this document is interesting because here the witness says that once they saw Catalina and Francisco argue, and that Catalina pulled his beard, spat on his face, and threatened to leave con un negro. That's 1549. And the reason why I'm sharing this is because I think for us to think about such behavior from a middle-class white woman to allegedly react this way, because remember, this is third-person information that we're getting. These are the witnesses that were called to testify. And some witnesses were in favor of Francisco Bravo, giving very detailed information. And some witnesses were in favor of her family, saying that she was a good woman and that she respected her husband. And this is why the case lasted 5 years. But in addition to Catalina's character, which I'm very interested in developing her story, is the process of how violence was condoned in general in the island. The case lasted 5 years. The alleged lover was never found, yet Francisco Bravo was released under one of the reasons that men were allowed to receive a pardon from the crown. Not just that, but the fact that today and approximately for the past 6-7 years, the Dominican Republic holds the 3rd place in femicide. Honduras holds, this is in Latin America, Honduras holds the 1st place, and Trinidad and Tobago, I think, has 2nd. And this is why I wanted to share this part of the research as part of the colonial gender violence that, and I believe that as a post-colonial society, we have some remnants of those norms and those feelings and those ideals, beliefs that we used to have back then. Thank you.
What a wonderful presentation.
Thank you, Evelyn.
I was thinking about those first women who came. What resources did they have? How did they get there and all?
The free
Yes,
women
yes.
requesting licenses. Thank you for asking, because that allows me to cheat and talk about another woman. Because in 1575, a woman named Maria de Cota, who used to live in Santo Domingo with her mistress, they went to Seville in approximately 1559. Her enslaver died in Seville, and she manumitted Maria de Cota. She gave Maria de Cota her freedom, but she also left her 20 ducats. In the will, she wrote that exactly what Maria was worth, so that way her husband and no one in the family could try to resell her or negotiate, or gave her complete freedom in addition to 20 ducats, the currency at the time. Maria de Cota requested a travel license first to go to Peru. But it happens that in 1580, 3 years later, Maria is found in Seville requesting a second travel license, this time to go to Santo Domingo, and that she would like to go to Santo Domingo because she believes that she would be better off there. Here's the bonus, that now she's asking to go with her 3-year-old daughter, Magdalena. What happened there? Is it possible that Maria used the 20 ducats, maybe she had other resources, and did not, on her way to Peru, stopped in Santo Domingo, met someone, had a daughter, goes back to Seville, and then now wants to go back to Santo Domingo? Again, that document is available in the First Blacks in the Americas database. Why do I share that story with you to answer your question? Because it is highly possible, in my opinion, that the women, the free Black women who were in Seville requesting travel licenses, had the resources to at least request the license and pay for, let's say, the ticket, right, to get there. Perhaps some of them had more than just the ticket to get there. We find another woman in 1553. Her son is in Seville, and he requests to go back to Santo Domingo, and he explains that he needs to go back to attend to his mother and their estate. So this is a free woman and her free son who own an estate in 53 Santo Domingo. This means that this is highly possible that they either, one, had enough resources to maybe explore and settle and try it out, or they simply just had enough to get on the ship to go to a new place where they thought maybe they could be better. Same reasons that immigrants leave their places today, the push and pull factor, right, of mobility in amongst humans. And I think that those are the two possibilities.
Thank you, gracias. Great presentation. I'm sorry I
nada.
came in a little late, but what I did capture is fascinating, and I want to thank you for just amplifying the voices and the experiences of these women, right? And I was struck by the gender and the whole sort of control, right, and the price given to women's reproductive, right? And of course, a lot of that, the violence was also, related to rapes and all of that, right? The sort of the usage of women's bodies. I'm wondering, what do you make any connections, or when you talk about this, to some of the ongoing debates around reproductive, rights in the United States, but across the world, and how in some ways we're still discussing, right, and sort of like debating that. So I'm just curious what your thoughts are, or if that comes up in your lectures, with college-age women and so forth. So I'm just sort of thinking out loud.
That's a fascinating question. It's very charged. It's political. It's emotional. It's personal. It's institutional. It's all of those things. And yes, we have those conversations. And what do I think and what do I hear in return? It's interesting that before the reproductive ability of a woman was so precious, was priced, right? To a point that it was defended for different reasons amongst two different races. And it seems as if some of that, in terms of the resources that women of color have access to and the resources that white women have access to, continue to be unequal today. That's the first thing. But I did say that politically charged, and I think as opposed to before, that it was more economically charged, I want to say, in the colonial times. It was politically charged for white women, but for black women, it was more financially charged. I don't think they really cared about her reproduction unless it was a healthy reproduction. Case in point, the example of the woman, right? She's sick, she's not good, we're gonna return her, and we don't care about her. So you really don't care about the woman being well and being able to carry a child. You care more about that black woman being able to carry your property and your wealth. And today is completely different because it is a political argument, many times hypocritical, and we're seeing it lately in some political races where, you find these politicians who have double morale, and they're still ahead in the polls. So which is it? In Spanish, there's a saying that says, "Te queda con el peso o el peso y medio?" You give me the dollar or the half dollar. Like, which is it, right? Make up your mind. What do you really care about? Do you really care about the woman? Do you really care about the possible child that the woman is carrying? Do you really care about family values? Do you care about a human being? And the reason that I said that this is a question that is political, institutional, so many things, and personal, is because we had to make a decision at one point in my family with my mom and my soon-to-be 30-year-old brother. My mom was very ill, and the doctor kept saying, okay, we're gonna need to make a decision. She could barely hold, it's gonna be one or the other. And there I am with my stepdad, and I'm 13 years old, And I'm saying, I want my mother. And I want every single person to think today, if there is a pregnant woman carrying, and you have to make a choice, and that woman has other children, ask their children, do you want your mother or do you want the fetus? I said I wanted my mother. However, I did say, can you try? Like, what? I don't understand what's going on, right? And I mean, my mom, she was hospitalized like 10 times. It was a very difficult pregnancy. Thank God they both lived. My brother is a great human being. He's like my kid because we're like 15 years apart. He says I'm his hermama instead of his hermana, you know? And we have a great relationship. And he knows the story. He knows the story. We didn't hide it from them. So that's my response. And I hope I answered your question. Okay, thank you.
So, thank you, Lisette, for coming.
Welcome.
I have sort of two questions, and you already sort of answered one, right? But one is, how did you get interested in this? And the second is, I wonder how this research by you and by others is being received in the República Dominicana or within the Dominican diaspora, because some hostile, I don't know how we want to
Which
describe
one?
it.
The one on
Any, all of this research on
black
first-
folks, right?
on yeah, black folks in Santo Domingo, but also on the violence of slavery and freedom in the time period. Yeah.
How I became interested in, initially it was the topic of women in general, and my master's is in developmental disability, another passion of mine. And in 2006, I think it was, the then ambassador of the US went to a restaurant in the Dominican Republic, and they were denied entrance because there were too many black folks going into that restaurant. And as a result, the country received backlash, and a lot of people started talking about how Dominicans don't want to be black and how Dominicans are racist. And a lot of scholarship began to be produced on negative Dominican racial identity. And I said, wait, but that's not how I am. That's not how my family is. That's not how I was brought up. I want to tell a different story. Why aren't these people who are saying, in general, that Dominicans are racist, not writing about slavery, when lots of Dominican scholars have written about slavery in Santo Domingo and black culture in Santo Domingo? Why aren't they talking about that? So I thought that it was important to tell that part of the story, and I switched then to becoming a historian. At that time, I started thinking about identity, but I wanted to focus on the positive part. And actually, you saw some of that positive part last presentation when we danced Afro-Dominican music, and you heard palos, right? That is part of the positive racial Dominican identity that reflects the African ancestry in the Dominican Republic. So that is to answer the first part of the question. And I first decided to focus on women, just women in general. I'm gonna also include the Taino women in the research, not just free and enslaved blacks and Spanish women, but also the Taino women, because that also is missing in Santo Domingo. A little bit has been written in Spanish, but we know about the women in Peru, the women in Mexico, the women in Cuba, and some in Puerto Rico, but Santo Domingo is still thriving, right? It's still waiting to not thriving, but still waiting to be lifted. And I plan to include that. How is it being received? Unfortunately, in the past 10 years, a group of mega, ultra, very committed nationalists have emerged in the country. And they promote patriotism. They actually dress as in military clothes. They show up at different cultural events. If you're trying to hold a public event that celebrates African ancestry, they show up and they become violent. Recently, 2 weeks ago, Maribel Nunez, I want to say her last name correctly, they were doing a performance, and the performance was actually portraying the execution of Anacaona, the Taino cacica in Hispaniola. And they showed up and they dismantled the entire performance. The police was there, but the police couldn't protect them appropriately. The group is very large and is growing. But to me, and I'm sharing that part specifically, there's a contradiction, and I think there's also a lie, because I just think that they are hateful. Because if they're rejecting the African ancestry in the Dominican Republic, the event was a performance representing the Tainos. It was Anacaona. And then I'm thinking, well, how do you think Anacaona died? She was spooked? Or de un susto? She was executed. Obviously, they were not showing exactly what happened, but it was a representation. And the reason why I say it's a lie and it's a hypocrisy is because they showed up, and they also showed up because it was Maribel doing it, and they know that she's vocal about human rights in the Dominican Republic for Haitians, for Dominicans of Haitian descent. So am I. They have tried to sabotage events where I have been a panelist along with other Dominicans from the diaspora. And they show up in front of the events, they show up in front of the institutions. And we're calling the Dominican government to say, look, one of these days, these people, they're really they might do something serious. And the government has yet to approach them and do anything, and they continue to grow. And the reason why I share this is because last year, one of my students tagged me on a post on Instagram when I used to have Instagram. And I responded, oh, wait until I record my video. Remember that skit I told you that I do sometimes in my class? Actually, I do it in every class, to show how many times the island has changed names. Well, that's the video that it's being produced, okay? So I said to my student, oh, wait until I record the video. And they took a picture, they went on the internet, they took pictures of me. They took that and posted in their pages. And there are pictures of me reading to children in the Dominican Republic. It's an activity that I do every year. Haven't done it since COVID, but we have been doing it every year. It's called Reading with Joy. And they took a picture of me. They're saying, she comes from the US to the Dominican Republic to indoctrinate children to hate the Dominican Republic and to fuse Haiti with the Dominican Republic, and we know where you live. With a picture of me. And they're not doing, this is not just me, they're doing this to a lot of other people who advocate for social justice, not selective social justice, because I have an issue with that. If you're gonna be someone who's gonna be fair and you're gonna be good-hearted, don't come to me and give me a hug just on LGBTQI month, and then because you support LGBTQI, but then on Black History Month, it's like you're not my friend. I'm sorry. That's not how it works. You have to be inclusive. Your heart has to be at the right place. if you say that you are someone who defends social justice. So that is how it's being received by some people, I do have to say. But unfortunately, I have to bring them up because they are gaining strength, and their posts are very disturbing. And like I said, they now show their faces, and they show up at different places, and they're not hiding. Oh, thank you. Yes. Evelyn, some of them, close your eyes. That's how they look. Okay?
It's like the
That's how dark some of those ultra nationalists who are Haitian haters look. Okay? It's no joke. And I say close your eyes because when people would tell me, oh, so I show a picture of my grandfather, and I was like, oh, my grandfather, close your eyes, that's him. That's how dark he was. So yes. Yes, yes. When I said that they have shown up to panels that I have been a guest, is with other male scholars who are part of the panel. Scholars here in the U.S. About 3 years ago, I want to say, or 4 years ago, they created a flyer with our pictures, and they were circulating it. There was, with each person, so-and-so, CUNY professor, and circulating amongst their hate chain. And we're saying, why doesn't the government address this? In fact, at the Dominican Book Fair this year, there were some events and book launches that had to be canceled because they threatened to go and interfere with the fair. So those authors couldn't display their books, and they couldn't go do their presentations. There was a lot of rejection for a book called Tula's Poop, La Muñeca de Tula. It's a children's book, and it's written in Creole and Castellano, Creole and Spanish. And they're saying, oh, now you want, you want to bring Haitians into the country, that now you want to bring Creole into our books, and you want to teach our kids Creole, and you want to force us to. But they don't say anything when you learn English. English is taught, and you have books published in English, in French, and Spanish in the Dominican Republic. So it is obviously a selective hate and xenophobism.
I have one experience where I was traveling in the Dominican Republic, and there were checkpoints. And I was traveling with a Haitian male who had been helping sort of getting around and what have you. And I speak Spanish. And the officers came, and there's an expectation, sometimes you give money and what have you. And they checked the car to make sure we didn't have other Haitians. They just happened to know this particular person. And they said, este está bien, este negrito está bien. But they would, so it was an experience for me to have witnessed that checkpoint.
Unfortunately, this is how it's being received now. We hope it gets better. I spoke to my cousin 2 days ago, and he said, Lee, don't worry. That's a very small, selective group. There are more of us, the good ones. They're not going to continue to grow. And I hope that that's the case. I really hope that that's the case, because some of their threats are getting out of hand. And like I said, they're not afraid. They're showing up, they're showing their faces, they wear a uniform, and they show up carrying the Dominican flag to the places, and it's dozens of them. When they show up to an event, it's dozens of them. So you can imagine how one can feel intimidated or question what line are they going to cross, and how much further is the government going to allow it? Because my question is how difficult it is for the head of state, the president, to simply say, this violence is unacceptable. That's all you have to do. You know what? Dude, even if you are with them, Can you at least pretend? Well, but then again, based on what we have experienced in this country, then that, some people don't pretend. Some people just show what they are, so, who they are. So I guess we'll just have to wait.
I was going to ask, what has been the reception of this research to your students?
By the students, they like it. They have a good time, especially when we start comparing things that used to happen back then and things, and I'm smiling in the sense, I'm smiling for satisfaction. Obviously, when they begin to look at the life of the enslaved, and when we look at the laws of 1521 that were created, the other laws of 1535, 38, 45, the Código Negro in the Spanish Código Negro in 1784, they compare how back then the mobility of black bodies were policed as opposed to the mobility of black bodies today. And so obviously when you begin to see similarities from 420 something years ago to today, that's disheartening. But I'm pleased at their critical thought and the questions that they ask in that sense. I'm pleased when they're able to go to the First Blacks in the Americas website, and the assignment is very simple. It's very quick. You can look at 3 of the summaries. The summaries are very short, 3 to 4 sentences, and select one that interests you. And when I read the reason, because they have to say why they picked the document, then I know that at least it's like, oh, okay, they read it. First Blacks? Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
Lisette was one of the scholars who did the research that allowed the creation of this really fabulous digital humanities project through the Dominican Studies Institute. And it has the most amazing material on it. And tomorrow we're going to look at how you can use this to teach classes from.
Absolutely.
Which is what she does all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. And the project was born in the CUNY Dominican Studies Institute at the City College of New York. It was the idea and creation of Professor Anthony Stevens Acevedo. He's a historian and paleographer, brilliant paleographer. He can read all of these documents. And it's very hard. And he's so good at it that before First Blacks was created, he created something called the Spanish Teaching and Learning Paleography Tool, which is also part of the CUNY Dominican Studies Institute. And I can pull that one up because if you ever want to try to learn to read any of these documents, then you can use the Spanish Paleography Tool, which was developed with an NEH grant. If you want to learn, you're going to come here where it says choose. Let's go with the first one, 1535. It gives you the style of the writing because the writing changed with time. This one is Cortesana script. You see the third one as Humanística. And I'm going to click on both, one first, so that you see the difference. Cortesana, right? Humanística. Have them read one of these. Well, Professor Stevens also created the Spanish paleography tool. And for 2 years, thanks to the NEH grant, a group of students worked to separate each of these words in boxes like these. I think the first one says, a 15 de julio. Okay. Años, exactly. So on July 15th, a 15 de julio, 1552, años. And the first word on the other line, I think it says, salí de Santo Domingo. I left Santo Domingo. Let's see. Salí de Santo Domingo. Can you imagine working on this for 2 years, separating each one of these? And you may be asking, well, how is this helpful to learn to read paleography? Because the more that you practice by looking at the boxes and you become familiar with the handwriting, you are able to tell which letter is which. I think the next word says negros. Aha. Okay. I want to say, en vieron de, vieron. Let's see. Los negros. Oh, we're still in this. Ajá. Y otros 11 días. Y otros, right? Right? You have to be crazy.
What by 3 o'clock in the afternoon is completely unintelligible, 9 o'clock the next morning or 8 o'clock the next morning when you're rested is like, oh, why couldn't I read that yesterday? Right? Well, yeah.
Yes, yes. I invite you to look at the Spanish paleography too, and tomorrow we are going to be working with some of the first Blacks in the Americas documents.
So thank you, everybody. Yeah? And thank you, Lisette. Right?
Thank you. Thank you.
So,
Hopefully I'll see you tomorrow. Bring some friends.
yeah. No, there are, yes.
We might, because we are going to listen to some videos. You're going to be comparing some of the Afro music from the Caribbean.
Oh, well.
Yeah.